Hi there, I'm Heather from whatareyougivingaway.com. Today I want to talk a little bit about resistance, moving from resistance to acceptance. I went to see the movie Star Trek last week. Now, I'm not a Trekkie fan by any stretch. My husband is a little more so than me, but it was date night and that was at the cheap seats, and so we decided to check it out. And I liked it surprisingly much more than I expected to like it. But what I really found about it, I don't know, some of you may have seen it, but it's a really interesting story of somebody's journey. James T. Kirk, the infamous captain of the USS Enterprise, is a young man in this movie, and he's moving through a personal journey. You see, he's at the very beginning, he's born, and he goes through a childhood, and you don't see much of his childhood, but you get the sense that he's living with a lot of resistance in his childhood and in his youth. And what I really saw in the story was a resistance to a calling. He was resisting something that he recognized in himself, I think fairly early on, probably a calling to leadership. He was resisting it, I think, largely because he saw the incredible sacrifice his father had made for his calling. And so he lives a quite wild youth and young adulthood, really pushing the edges and pushing away from what he sees as what he's being called to do, because he just doesn't want to do it, doesn't want to accept it, doesn't want to make the sacrifice it requires. And there's a lot of really interesting lessons in that. And one of the interesting lessons is, no matter how much you resist it, that calling is going to keep tapping you on the shoulder. And gradually he becomes a little bit more receptive to it. At one point, a man who knew his father taps him on the shoulder, almost literally, and says, you know, I think you have this calling. I think you should pursue it. You can be a great man. You can be a leader. And he still resists it and pushes, and eventually he does give in a little bit. He gives an inch, goes to the training college that he needs to go to join the whatever it is, the Enterprise in the end. But even there, he's determined to be resistant, determined to be a badass, really, and push away from what he sees calling him. And there's gradually all these processes that he goes through, and eventually he does accept the mantle of leadership, but it's not without being tested along the way. It's not without having a mentor tell him that this is his calling, and him waking up and realizing that, being faced with incredible obstacles, including people who are very resistant to his calling, people who don't believe he has it, people who don't trust him with it. And I think there's a lot of really incredible lessons there, and I've reflected on that in myself as well. I have felt some calling to leadership myself, and this doesn't have to be about leadership, but in my own life, I've had that calling, but it's a process. These things don't just happen. It's not overnight that you say, okay, I have this calling, and suddenly you take a step into that life, and that's the end, end of that story. These are journeys that we go through, and I recognize that so much in James T. Kirk as he goes through the story to the point where he actually has to do something that's really quite distasteful, in a sense, to eventually accept the leadership mantle that he feels on, because he feels it so strongly that he feels that if he doesn't take that leadership, a lot of people will die. And that's how the story goes. I mean, fairly dramatic. It's a movie, of course. Not all of us have such dramatic decisions to make. But there are so many lessons in there that we in our lives, I think most of us will move from a place of resistance to some place of acceptance, because these things aren't easy. There's so many reasons why we shouldn't follow callings, because they're tough, because they require a lot from us. They require sacrifice, incredible sacrifice, and they require us to stretch ourselves, and stretching it hurts sometimes. I've been reflecting on that kind of in my own life as well. As I said, I feel some calling to leadership, and I wanted to, some of you will recognize what this is. I've showed it before in here. This is my leadership stick from Kenya. And I'll just tell you a little story about it, and then I'll move from there to asking you to join the conversation. This leadership stick really, for me, reflects one of those steps for me in my journey of accepting a calling. I was in Kenya, and we were traveling with a group of Canadians, and we were going to different villages, visiting some of the projects that the organization I work with was funding there. And when we'd visit the village with this group of Canadians, very often we were given gifts, and this leadership sticks similar to this were generally given to the people in our group that were seen as the leaders. Now, those were always the men in the group, because in Kenya it was accepted, especially in these small villages, remote villages, it was accepted that the men were the leaders. Ironically, one of those men that was receiving that was actually an employee of mine, but that's kind of beside the story. Anyways, there was a point when I was in Kenya when I mean, the women were being given gifts as well. We were given necklaces, and some of you have seen it. There's one hanging on my wall, and they're quite lovely. But there was a point on that trip where I decided I need to go home with a leadership stick. I don't know what it was, but something tweaked in me and made me realize that, you know what, despite the resistance, despite the fact that I was actually raised in a fairly conservative home where women were not seen as leaders, despite the opinions of people around me, despite the obstacles, I needed to accept that mantle of leadership. I needed to take that on because I did see it as my calling. So before I left Kenya, I was determined to get a leadership stick, and I did actually. I found one in the market, and I brought one home, and I've loved it ever since. It's one of my favorite possessions because it always reminds me of what I took on when I accepted this leadership stick. And so today I want to encourage you to think about, what are the things that you are resisting? What are the things that you, like James T. Kirk, are pushing away? And maybe it's causing you to run the other direction. Maybe it's causing you to make choices that you're not all that proud of because you just don't want to take that on. It's not necessarily leadership I'm talking about, but something else. Maybe there's something that you know deep in your heart that you are being called to do this, and I think deep down you probably know that doing this will make you feel fulfilled and feel like you are in the place where you belong. But at the same time, it's tough to accept, and it's hard. It's it's risky. Accepting callings are almost always risky, because I'll admit it for myself. I mean, even since I bought this leadership stick, there have been times when I've been so incredibly challenged in my leadership. There have been times when I woke up in the morning thinking, what am I doing? Am I kidding myself? I'm really not a leader. I'm not good at this. I'm failing. I'm screwing up. I should go back to doing something I can do without having to lead people. And I have those thoughts on at least a weekly basis. But at the same time, I have to take it seriously. I brought this stick home because I need to take that seriously. So one of the things I do with this stick is when I do workshops, I pass it around the circle and I use it as a talking stick. That's more of a native tradition, having talking sticks. And when we pass the talking stick around, each person who accepts the talking stick accepts the invitation to speak of their story, to share their story. And in this case, I want to share this talking stick with you. I'd like you to accept it and take it and talk to me about what you're resisting and what your little journey is, moving from resistance to acceptance. What is that calling that you just you're not quite certain about, you're not quite certain you want to take that risk? Take it. Write something on your blog or write something in the comments and accept the talking stick, and with that accept some responsibility, I think, for moving forward and taking some kind of little step. It may not be buying a leadership stick in Kenya, but maybe it's doing something that you're a little scared to do. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.